Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, striking Canada Post workers had been ordered back to work as of today. There is some disruption as a number of other workers have set up a picket line at the processing center in Richmond. They say in solidarity. They're calling it a community picket line. We'll take you to the scene and hear from one of them. And we're asking you on the open line, with Canada Post just being the latest strike ended by government intervention, is the strength of labor unions at risk? What do you make of the labor movement at this point? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. CBC reporter Pinky Wong is live right now at the Canada Post Processing Centre in Richmond. Hi, Pinky. Tell me what's happening around you right now? I do see some people holding up signs.
So behind me, we can see a picket line of more than 1,000 people standing here. Some are from East Van Workers Assembly, some are from ILWU, and some call themselves concerned citizens. They're here to support the Canadian Unions of Postal Workers. And earlier, I've talked to Andrew Palmer, the local union president. She said more than 200 employees are scheduled to come back to work this morning. And right now, the camera is panning where we see lines of cars. Those are the Canada Post workers in the car waiting to get into the facility. But the president told me because of health and safety reasons, they are not crossing the line. And so far, I've not seen anyone trying to cross the line.
Okay, and you said about a dozen behind you right now and some cars there, obviously. What are people telling you from your conversations with them?
Yeah, so I talked to some of the Canada Post workers in their car waiting, and they've said they've been here since 8 a.m. this morning. Some told me they're angry because the union told them to come back to work today, but they couldn't cross the picket line, so they were just stuck in the car since 8. Some told me that they feel neutral about the picket line happening, but they're still going to wait until their shift ends. They're going to sit in the car in the rain until their shift ends and see what's going to happen next.
Okay, Pinky, thank you very much. CBC reporter Pinky Wong live right now at the Canada Post Processing Centre in Richmond. We're going to hear more from one of those people who has formed and set up at that community picket line, as they're calling it, asking you on the open line as well, what do you think of the state of the labor movement right now? With the order to go back to work from the Canada Industrial Relations Board saying workers should resume going back to the job, should go back to the job as a result of those talks being at an impasse and no likely resolution by the end of the year. The Industrial Relations Board said back to work as of today. So is the strength of labor unions at risk? Certainly, CUPW were not happy. They condemned that decision. You can call us with your thoughts on the open line, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining me now is Rob Ashton. He is at the picket line. He is president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And tell me what brought you to the processing center, the Canada Post Processing Center today.
I come down here today as a concerned citizen with what's happening, especially what's happening with the Section 107s that the federal government is imposing on unions, which is giving employers what they've always wanted.
Okay.
And that's sorry.
Pardon me, if you could just clarify Section 107, which I think you were doing anyway. Thank you.
So a Section 107 is quite simply the government of Canada stepping in, forcing workers back to work through the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. And it's a way for employers to get away from negotiating freely with their workers.
I see that you're wearing a button that says "Stop the War on Workers." Now, you are president of the Longshore and Warehouse Union. Are you there in that capacity?
Today I'm here as a concerned citizen, but our union has definitely seen its fair share of Section 107s levied against us. the longshore strike last year, and just recently the strike with ILW, or sorry, the lockout with ILW Local 514. And we're fed up with it. And just like every other federally organized worker should be fed up with it as well, because the Canadian government right now is basically spitting on workers' rights. And they're giving a free hand to employers right now to run roughshod over us all.
All right. Do you think, and yes, you refer to the port strike and lockout and government intervention there, the rail workers strike as well. Is there a precedent being set here?
Definitely, and it's a dangerous precedent. It's not only happened to the railway unions and our unions on the West Coast, it's also happened to QP 375 in Montreal, the longshore union there. And what this is proving to employers in the federal sector, that they don't have to talk to us. They don't have to negotiate with us. And a lot of the federal sector employers are loving this fact, because they know now that the federal government will enact the Section 107 and send workers back to work. So what do? You know, workers of this country have to wake up. The working class has to wake up, because the federal government isn't their friends. And quite honestly, I know I'm getting sick and tired of lip service from the parties in the federal government parties in Canada, all of them, because that's what we seem to be getting lip service from, is people that are saying you gotta, we support workers. Well, where is that support? Abolish Section 107, pull it out of the labor code, and let's actually start doing the work of the voters in this country and protecting the voters and not the multinational corporations.
Isn't that section there to allow for the government to intervene in the case of severe impact from a strike? And given that the Canada Post strike had been going on for several weeks, nearly a month, and that we've seen the impact on small businesses with people who have been relying on things like medication. Wasn't it don't Canadians expect the government to do something about that and resume this vital service?
So the problem with the Section 107 is we vote MPs into Ottawa, and those MPs are supposed to speak on behalf of their constituents. And although I don't like it, I abhor workers being legislated back to work, but there was a process, a decent process, where members of parliament were allowed to speak on behalf of their constituencies. But now with the Section 107s, what we see is you have one minister, the Minister of Labour, that decides by himself when this has to end. And so what they're doing actually is stealing the voices of Canadian citizens, stealing away the voices of their members of parliament. And that's unacceptable. One person shouldn't be allowed to make these decisions.
But if I can just interject there, the minister referred this to the Industrial Relations Board, who made the decision, right?
Yeah, the ministers referred a lot of them to the CIRB. And look where we all end up. We all end up back to work, and the employers get what they want. No need to talk to the unions or to the workers.
Finally, Rob, can I ask you, given the picket line there are Canada Post workers sitting in their cars right now. Can they cross to go back to work should they want to? What would happen in that case?
So what we're actually doing now is the community picket line had a discussion about it, and because we don't want to hurt the workers anymore, because the government and Canada Post is doing a fine job of that, we've agreed to allow the workers to enter the work site to get this back up and running. But who knows, maybe this community picket line will be back one day.
And do you know of any others at other locations in the province?
Not to my knowledge. I've been here all day, as well as a bunch of staunch community activists that are sick and tired of the federal government and these Section 107s.
Rob, really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Okay. No problem. Thank you kindly.
Rob Ashton, he is there as a citizen at what they're calling a citizen picket line. He's president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And you can give us a call. Let us know what you think of what's happening there in Richmond. And what do you think of his comments there, the strength of the labor movement right now? What impact are these orders for various workers who had been striking to go back to work? What impact is that going to have on the labor movement in Canada? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And let's go to Sean, first of all, at Main Island. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi. What are your thoughts on what's happening right now and today?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the caller's points there. The right to strike is protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Freedom of Association, and this was established in a Supreme Court of Canada case in 2015 involving the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor and the government of Saskatchewan. And it feels like the federal government's reach for this Section 107, it really feels like this charter right to strike is now a second-class charter right. And the other comment I'd make is that former federal labor minister Seamus O'Regan, he didn't reach for this tool, and he really put the pressure on the employers and the unions to come to a settlement without compulsion. And we see that changing now. I think it takes away the incentive for employers to negotiate with unions, and they just wait out and wait for the government to save them. And so I think we're going to see, unintended consequences like these community pickets and perhaps other things.
Sean, great to hear from you. Thank you very much for getting us started here.
Thank you.
To recap, 55,000 striking Canada Post workers have been ordered to go back to work today by the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. Last week, Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon said that the month-long strike didn't show any signs of progress, and he asked the Labour Board to assess whether a deal was likely or negotiations were at an impasse. The board agreed and ordered an end to the strike until the current agreement runs out in May. And today, those workers were to be back as of 8 a.m. We're seeing some hiccups to that as non-postal workers have set up a community picket line at one location that we know of at the processing center of Canada Post in Richmond. And given this intervention, as you heard, intervention in disputes at the ports and the railways, in each case, unions have condemned those moves, asking you now, is the strength of labor unions at risk? And what do you make of the state of the labor movement right now? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Joining me for this conversation is Jim Stanford. He's an economist and director of the Center for Future Work. Jim, good afternoon. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
What's your reaction to what you've been hearing at this community picket line?
Oh, that's an interesting tactic that Rob Ashton and others obviously were down there trying to show some support for the postal workers. The union itself, the Postal Workers Union itself, of course, has to weigh the legal consequences of ignoring the Industrial Relations Board ruling. So they did encourage their members to return to work this morning. But outside citizens, as Rob positioned himself, obviously can go down there and have a protest of their own. So in a way, it was a kind of unofficial picket line to show support for the postal workers and show that even though they have been ordered back, they have some support in the community and obviously support from other trade unionists.
And as Rob said, they had a discussion and they would not prevent Canada Post workers from going into work. And that's a discussion that they had, probably thinking of those repercussions and the legalities around this, as you mentioned. Were you surprised when Labour Minister Stephen McKinnon did take the steps that he took last week after several weeks of saying government wants to step back on this and wait for a negotiated agreement?
Right. Yeah, I wasn't so much surprised, but I was certainly disappointed. Obviously, the pressure was building on the government. And as you know, the government's got problems of its own right now in Ottawa, given everything that's happening up there. So the business community in particular was very vociferous, saying, order these people back. And business lobbyists have been saying that every dispute that we've had, the ports, the railways, the airlines. Every time the Business Council and other powerful business voices come in and say the government just has a duty to order everyone back, as if as if the Charter of Rights didn't exist. That's the problem. So I'm not surprised, but I do think it sends a very inconsistent message from the government. On the one hand, they say they want the parties to reach a freely negotiated agreement, and those are the best agreements, and they're right on that score. But on the other hand, they've shown repeatedly now that they will buckle to the business pressure when the heat gets too high and order the workers back. So the problem there, Michelle, is this is a repeated game, if you like. And it's not just this dispute that is complicated by a back-to-work order. What happens is the more that businesses see this happening, and it is now becoming a bit of a routine, that in a way pollutes future negotiations, because employers will have this in the back of their minds saying, oh, I don't really need to reach an agreement because if it comes to an impasse, the government will order them back.
But not
so
every
it does in a way.
Pardon me, go
Sorry.
ahead. Go ahead.
It just distorts future negotiations because of this distinct possibility that the cost of disagreement for employers will be short-circuited by government ordering the workers back. Okay,
but not every employer is Canada Post or a rail line or the port, right? These are services that some might argue are essential. There has been that argument that the impact of disruption to these services is so severe that warrants some kind of intervention. And so given, we had the point that the previous Labour Minister did not use this section to the extent that Stephen McKinnon is this just the world that we live in now, where there is so much more reliance on the supply chain being intact, on being able to move goods, that there is going to be that intervention in these particular cases?
Well, I mean, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, all of these big disputes that we've been talking about are in the federal labor jurisdiction, because they're all about, big international or national transportation and communication systems, which are regulated by the federal government. Most workers work under the provincial labor jurisdiction. So in this case, the federal government and its Section 107 and so on wouldn't come into play. So in a way, these are exceptions because they are important national undertakings, railways and ports and post offices, of course. I do think there's a bit of a contradiction, Michelle, in the argument that these are essential services and therefore we have to order them back. In most cases, these are private corporations. The railways are private, immensely profitable corporations, largely owned by foreign investors. The ports, likewise, private corporations. So if they are an essential service in that regard, why is it left to private enterprise, and in particular these large private corporations, to operate them and then to profit from them when times are good? The ports in particular made a killing. The ports and the shipping companies made just a killing during the aftermath of the pandemic, when everything was in short supply and container shipping costs skyrocketed, and they literally made more money in 2 years than they had made in their entire history. And that was one of the factors that led to all the inflation that we grappled with. So if indeed it is an essential service, perhaps we should operate it that way rather than handing it over to private companies. Now, Canada Post is in a different category. Of course, it's a crown corporation, but it is still a corporation. And it is, I think, still faces, all of the disciplines of running a corporation, including reaching an agreement with its own staff. And so, I do think, obviously, strikes have a disruption. They impose an economic cost. That, in effect, is the idea of a strike. But for government to come in and just sort of snap their fingers and say, okay, enough is enough, now we'll order an end to it, does have, I think, unintended consequences for subsequent negotiations.
Let's take another call here from Eric in Ladner. Hi, Eric. What are your thoughts on the state of the labor movement right now in light of these back-to-work orders? Hi, Eric, are you there? Okay, we don't have our connection with Eric. If you'd like to call us back, please, it's 1-800-825-5950 or 604-669-3733. Let's go to Ali in Vancouver. Hi, Ali.
Hey, Michelle. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure. What are your thoughts? How do you feel about these interventions in these disputes?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous for labor, especially because a lot of corporations just wait around for government to step in and force workers back, or they impose like binding arbitration, for example. And I think, although with that being said, like just hearing what's happening in Richmond right now at the processing plant and other unions stepping up to support CUPW, I think that's a very important step to take for unions, is that we have to show up for each other, and that's the only way we're going to get things done.
Okay. You're a member of a union, are you, Ellie?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the call.
All right.
Good to have you. I think we have Eric now. Hi, Eric in Ladner. Okay, it sounds like we don't. Eric, my apologies for our connection issues there. I have a couple of minutes before the newscast here, and Jim Stanford is with me, economist and director of the Center for Future Work. Just in our minute or two before the news here, there have been challenges launched by unions. The rail union launched a court challenge against that back-to-work order. What impact do you think might that have?
Yeah, I think that will be another important piece of this. We do have this thing called the Charter of Rights in Canada, and there are some important precedents now, one of which actually has BC roots, dating back to a dispute with the BC Teachers Federation under a previous government. And over again, the Supreme Court has confirmed that the right to free assembly in the Charter of Rights does apply to the right to have collective bargaining and representation and effective bargaining, which means you can't just have a contract imposed on you. So my guess is that those court challenges have got some real potential, but unfortunately, they take several years to pan out. So we'll see down the road if any of these actions get overruled by the court.
My guest, Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work. Lots of calls coming in as we ask you. As of today, Canada Post workers are to be heading back to work. They've been ordered back by the Canada Industrial Relations Board, ending or putting a pause to the just about month-long strike until May, when the current agreement is set to end or run out. And we're asking you, what impact does that have on the labor movement? More of your calls coming up after this short break. This is BC Today here on CBC. Now, you heard our guest refer to drama in Ottawa, the federal government. Of course, we have had the news out of Ottawa yesterday with now former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland resigning from cabinet. And we also have had calls from opposition leaders for Justin Trudeau to resign. Lots of emails on that topic yesterday, too. Yadja writes from Burnaby. I fault Ms. Freeland for acting irrationally and rather selfishly. Canada needs a coherent government at this time. We have so many challenges ahead. The Liberals need her, and she could have waited until the next election to do so. In my opinion, it seems personal. I think as a politician, you must always put the country first. Jonathan writes from Vancouver Quadra, choosing Chrystia Freeland as finance minister was one of the best decisions that Trudeau has made. Now that she's stepping down, I no longer have much confidence in Trudeau. It's time for the Liberal Party to choose a new leader, and I would gladly support Chrystia Freeland. If Trudeau is still leading the party at the next election, then I don't know who I would vote for. Jake writes, Trudeau lost my trust when he did not live up to his promise regarding proportional representation. This is the only move anybody can do to restore trust in democracy. Aaron writes, Ms. Freeland's resignation clearly confirms Justin Trudeau should resign. If he doesn't, the Liberal Party will be decimated in the next election. That won't be good for Canadians. Catherine writes, Trudeau should have resigned years ago. He was never qualified to be Prime Minister of Canada. Cindy writes, I think this is fantastic news. It shows how weak the Liberal caucus is. However, I do not think Trudeau should resign. It's just a matter of time now before Trudeau goes down, and I can't wait to see it happen. And Myrna writes, the Conservatives are now jumping on the bandwagon and the NDP, but how will any of them fix the economy? Put your money where your mouth is. Thank you for your emails. bctoday@cbc.ca. This is BC Today here on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on CBC News BC. And we are taking your calls on the state of the labor movement and what you think the impact is of Canada Post workers being ordered back to work in light of the month-long strike. We're going to take your calls and go back to our guest, Jim Stanford, coming up after this CBC News Update with Michelle Morton.
Good afternoon. Here are the headlines from the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre has congratulated Tamara Jansen for her win in yesterday's by-election in the riding of Cloverdale-Langley City. Poilievre notes the Conservative earned twice as many votes as all the other candidates combined. The seat has swung between the Liberals and Conservatives in recent elections, but Elections Canada's preliminary results show Jansen, who previously held the seat from 2019 to 2021, earned more than 66% of the total vote. Police in Surrey are investigating a shooting that happened in the city's Newton neighborhood just before 6 p.m. yesterday. They say officers responded to a call from a woman who said she and her husband had been shot. Police say the two victims were taken to the hospital with serious injuries. Investigators are now looking for two suspects described as South Asian men last seen driving a dark-colored sedan. And rainfall warnings are covering both west and east coasts of Vancouver Island, Metro Vancouver, and the Central Fraser Valley. Environment Canada says heavy downpours may cause flash floods and pooling on roads, as well as localized flooding, particularly at lower elevations. It says about 100 millimeters of rain is expected on the west coast of Vancouver Island, while the east side is expected to get 50 and Metro Vancouver expected to get 70 millimeters by tomorrow. In the local forecast by Environment Canada, rain and gusty winds for today, highs of 8, and similar conditions for this evening. Now back to BC Today with Michelle Elliott.
It sure is a rainy one.
It is a wet one.
Michelle, thank you very much. That's Michelle Morton joining us from the CBC Vancouver newsroom. This is BC Today on CBC, and lots more coverage, of course, coming up throughout the day here on the afternoon shows in your region and in Metro Vancouver. Here's what's coming up on the Coast.
Hi, Michelle. Coming up on the Coast today, Kenny Chiu was a Conservative MP in Richmond until he lost to the Liberals in 2021. He says he wants to run again, so he is going to be our guest coming up this afternoon, and he'll weigh in on the current state of the federal Liberals. And while that is a big story in Ottawa, there's a big story in BC politics too. The BC Greens and the NDP have come up with an agreement to create political stability in this province, so we'll find out more. And that, of course, is kicking off starting at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Amy, thank you very much. Getting lots of emails on the topic of Canada Post and labor unions. Gordon writes from Parksville, Cup W strike has betrayed the Canadian public as they chose to strike during Christmas, which affects millions of Canadians wanting to reach out to loved ones. Okay, and we have another email here as well from Yan, who writes, if unionized workers think things are bad now, just wait until a Conservative government is elected. That's from Jan. And Lorraine writes, hi, Michelle, the unions should stand strong. Thank you very much for your emails. And Lorraine goes on to write, because of unions, other workplaces enjoy some of the protections in their own workplaces. Shame on the government. BC Today at cbc.ca is where you can send us your thoughts. This is BC Today here on CBC. It's 12:34. We're taking more of your calls on our topic today, which is asking you, is being ordered back to work having an effect on the state of the labor movement? Is the strength of unions at risk? And so, of course, today, Canadian postal workers have been ordered back to work by the Canada Industrial Relations Board. And for its part, Canada Post says it will work through the backlog on a first-in, first-out basis, and Canadians should expect delays into the new year. Some hiccups today as non-postal workers have set up what they call a community picket line at the Canada Post Processing Centre in Richmond. They say in solidarity. They are, however, going to let Canada Post workers through the line. Asking you, with Canada Post being the latest dispute to end with that government intervention, is the strength of labor unions at risk? What do you make of the state of the labor movement right now? Our number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. My guest is Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. Jim, I want to ask you as well. You and I have talked a lot about gig work and the rise of gig work, and the debate around protections there. Is there a sense that the workplace generally is changing and that the labor movement will need to adapt to that?
Well, workplaces certainly are changing, and the gig angle is actually quite relevant, Michelle, in this dispute at Canada Post. We've all heard about how Canada Post is losing business, in part because we're not sending letters anymore. We're sending emails and texts and everything else and paying our bills digitally. But also in the parcel business, we've seen a huge explosion of gig businesses in the parcel area, which had been a strong part of Canada Post's business. But now you've got all these companies that can hire people without even guaranteeing the minimum wage, and they're basically paid like Uber drivers are. They're paid for each individual parcel that they deliver, and in many cases are making well below the minimum wage. So here you have a situation where, the postal workers aren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but they had for many years what you'd call a living wage and basic benefits and a pension and so on. And yet, if the whole economy is going to shift towards where we can, businesses can hire mostly new Canadians desperate for work to deliver packages on a gig basis, what does that mean for other jobs, including in core activities like the post office? So the workplaces are certainly under pressure, and it is one of the reasons why this dispute has proven so challenging. I think the union here is trying to protect the principle that people doing a job like this should deserve a wage they can count on and basic benefits.
Scott wrote us from Burnaby. This current postal strike highlights the need to modernize Canada's postal service. With automation and robotics transforming industries worldwide, it's time to update our systems for greater efficiency and reliability. But modernization comes with fewer traditional jobs. To prepare for this future, Canada must start planning for a universal basic income. We need to embrace this change now, modernizing services while supporting workers in a rapidly evolving economy. Scott, thank you very much. I think we do have Eric now in Ladner. You got a lot of patience, Eric.
I am here, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. What are your thoughts on the state of the labor movement right now and the impact of these orders to go back to work?
Well, first off, I'm a union member myself, and I believe unions are very, very important. However, Canada Post was deemed an essential service during the pandemic, and I don't know if that was taken back, but it's an essential service. I'm a first responder, and we're not allowed to go on strike because of the effect it will have. And the problem with Canada Post that I see is they're an essential service who is just making themselves less and less essential every day. What doing this, especially during this time, isn't endearing themselves to anyone. And it's making more people look elsewhere to send those parcels. If they're losing millions and millions of dollars and wanting more and more pay, it doesn't really make sense.
So it's the impact of that. And we have heard of people, whether it be small business or others. We heard from a nonprofit that was turning to alternatives in light of not having that service. So, Eric, thank you very much for that. Does this end up then hurting the very workers that they're fighting for, because it will somehow, leave Canada Post with less ability to pay as they lose customers to those other services, Jim?
I don't think so. Again, we hear kind of conflicting stories. On the one hand, we have some business pundits saying, nobody uses the Canada Post anymore. They don't matter. And we should shut it down or privatize it or do something very different. But then on the other hand, we also hear this is an essential service, and the fact that it's not working is really hurting us. So both of those can't be true at the same time. I think it is in many ways an essential service. Now, we do have provisions in labor law for where services are essential in order to treat the workers fairly and not just, tell them you're in an essential service, you have to work and you have to work under the terms that I impose on you. That has never been applied in a consistent way at Canada Post. It is treated as an arm's length crown corporation supposed to negotiate deals like other employers do. So, and the same could go for railways and ports. We could all have a discussion about what's essential and what's not. But employers can't have it both ways. They can't say, yes, we're going to run this operation to make as much money as we can for our owners. And by the way, you're an essential worker and you have to work, no matter what. So I think there will be some discussions about, how to manage that. One point I will make, there obviously are a lot of costs and inconveniences from the postal strike and any strike. But at the same time, I think we also have to keep in mind the economic benefits. I know that sounds strange to say the economic benefits of a strike, but the economic benefits of a collective bargaining structure in which strikes from time to time occur. Strikes are still, it seems like they're happening all the time, but in historical perspective, they're still quite rare. In Canada. This year, we will lose about 1/20th of 1% of all work time due to strikes, including this postal strike, which is very, very small and a fraction of what it used to be in the 1970s and the 1980s. But when you have a process that allows disputes to be resolved and hopefully find new ways of dealing with things, then this can actually spill over and benefit other workers. We talked about the gig issue and how that could be handled. This could be a precedent. The Canada Post wants to have delivery on weekends, and if the union can find a way to negotiate a system for that isn't a gig system, that could be a precedent for other areas where gig practices are being applied. Another historical example from this very same company in the 1970s, the postal workers were on strike to win paid maternity benefits, which at the time was unheard of. The idea that you would pay someone while they were off a mother having a baby. Well, now we take it for granted as a social right in our society. And in fact, it's protected in law and funded through our employment insurance system. So these are ways in which the tough issues that can be taken on during a strike, even though it's disruptive at the time, can actually have economic benefits that spread through society and last for a long time. I think that's an important perspective to keep in mind.
Rick is our next caller in Victoria. Hi, Rick. What are your thoughts on Canada Post workers going back?
Well, my thoughts are more towards what Rob Ashton had to say, the longshoreman president. And he alluded to Stephen McKinnon making the decision all by himself that these guys go back to work. And that was said, well, no, he gave it to the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. Mm-hmm. Well, this is the second time it's gone to the Industrial Relations Board. The first time the mediator came in and said, oh, I don't know how to mediate. Sorry, I'm going to go back on holidays or wherever that person went.
He paused talks because he said they were so far apart, right?
That's right. So a mediator is supposed to come and tell the employer they have to sit down and the workers they have to sit down. And we do what's called collective bargaining. That's written. And that's supposed to be the rights of everybody in Canada. But we don't do that because we've told them we don't know how to mediate. This person that's getting paid to mediate doesn't know how. So we're just going to go back and you can go back on the picket line. And then a few weeks later, we're going to get this special mediator again. Well, we were already there. Well, we're going to have a little time out now because the special mediator doesn't know any more than they knew in the first place. So collective bargaining is a bit of a false narrative coming out of this Labour Minister of Canada right now, and I expected that out of the Conservative Party, but I didn't expect it out of the Liberal Party. So I hear Jagmeet Singh saying, we won't stand for this, and I hope that that's the way he goes with this because, collective bargaining is a very important part of the whole process.
Do you think the public would have had the appetite for a longer strike to get to that collective bargaining through or continued?
No, I think the public is tired and it's Christmas time and they're upset and there's a lot of things going on. You got the nonsense that's going on politically with other countries that is affecting us, and the people have just had enough. And if that mediator had done its job in the first place, the strike would have been over because the union was more than willing to sit down. It's the employer that doesn't want to sit down. And in the employer, who is the employer? The employer is the government. Come on, let's be realistic here. So I think that would have all been over, and the people would have had time to take a deep breath because our next battle's coming up, and we all know what that is, and that's the government of Canada going to have to stand up to the government of the United States. So it's just one thing after another.
Rick, thank you so much. Good to hear from you in Victoria. Also in Victoria, Rory is on the line now. What do you make of the state of labor unions right now, Rory?
Well, thanks, Michelle. I have a question. What can we do in this country to be more like Germany and some other European countries where labor representation is on the board of directors of large corporations? So in Canada, like the large federally regulated companies, I wonder, maybe Mr. Stanford has an idea because Germany has fewer and less, shorter labor disruptions than Canada. And actually there's, Republican members of Congress in the U.S. are calling for this. So there's a right-wing perspective that is actually in favor of this. Like, how can we move that forward in Canada?
Good question, Rory. Thank you very much. Jim?
The Europeans have some very interesting features to their collective bargaining system. For example, in most countries in Europe, any business over a certain size has to have what's called a works council, where the workers get to elect their representatives. Even if they're not unionized per se, the workers at least have a say and a voice there. And then for larger companies, as the caller mentioned, they get a certain number of seats on the board of directors, and that's another way for workers' voices to be heard in company decision-making and so on. It's not a magic bullet. There are some countries in Europe that have those systems, but actually have more strikes than Canada. France and Belgium, Denmark, those are countries where strikes are more frequent than Canada. On the other hand, in other places where it's been, they've been able to solve their issues without disputes, like Germany, as mentioned, it seems to make a difference. Another feature that I think is very interesting in Europe is this idea that collective agreements are established for an entire industry or an entire region, rather than going one company at a time or one workplace at a time. Sectoral bargaining is what it's called. And that's another idea that I think has a lot of potential to be applied in Canada, where you could get the benefits of a sort of level playing field and fair wages and benefits for everyone in an industry, not just at one particular unionized company.
Jim, always great to speak with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Michelle. Thank you.
Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work. Jack is on the line now from Victoria as well. 3 callers from Victoria now. And what are your thoughts on Canada Post and the state of labor unions, Jack?
Well, I think labor unions are quite weak right now. I'm a member of a union myself, and I'd like to see them do a better job of gaining, political power in Canada. But in terms of the postal workers' strike, I see the difference between a private sector strike, which only impacts the workers of that company and the company itself, no matter how big the company is, and a public sector strike, like the postal workers or the ports or a railway, where it impacts the whole country. And I just see them as being 2 different things. Now, I'm certainly not an expert on this, and I'd like to hear some expert commentary from both sides. But my own feeling about it as of today is that I do not have a problem with public sector workers in something as important as the post office being legislated back to work, as long as their rights and their wages are somehow protected. I don't know how that's done.
Jack, thank you very much for the call. So the difference between public sector and private sector in terms of the extent of the impact on the public. Trevor in Victoria as well. Hi, Trevor.
Hello.
Hi, and share your thoughts with us. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I've been a member of a private sector union and a public sector union. Currently, I'm a member of a public sector union. Work for the same employer as my East Coast counterparts, and they make $2 more an hour than our union. We've gone through collective bargaining. We've gone through binding arbitration, only to have binding arbitration overturned by retroactive legislation. So I think all that stuff's kind of a joke when it comes to arbitration, mediation. The government can just legislate and backdate it, and you get what you get. I think, basically, I think I said before, I have no problem with Canada Post going on strike. I mean, go on strike. Everybody go on strike. I mean, it is their right, and the general population has to accept that. It is what it is, whether it's the ports, postal service or whatever. And then I also think being a government employee, I think unions were kind of brought in the first place to protect workers' rights and whatnot, right, and for fair pay. So as a government worker, why do you need unions? If government's supposed to enforce the rule of law, why do you need unions as a government employee?
Yeah, what role are you playing in that relationship? Yeah. Trevor, thank you very much for the call. And take care. That's Trevor in Victoria. A lot of emails on this too. Doug writes, It is abundantly clear that a return to work order is undermining Canadian workers' rights and allowing corporations like Canada Post to negotiate in bad faith. We all want our mail. Some of us even need our mail, but those are both reasons that postal workers need our support. Kate writes, I support the postal workers' right to continue to strike. Perhaps a general strike will make the government stop intervening and stomping on the rights of workers. Michael writes, great to see the picket line. Unions need to resist the government attacks on unions. The only reason the strike went on so long is because employers no longer have to bargain because they know the government will force them back. Randy writes, the labor movement is losing battle after battle. The suits are winning, and with the unfair advantage of back-to-work legislation being used, income inequality continues to grow. Thank you so much for all of your emails. bctoday@cbc.ca. Always great to hear from you and all of your thoughts on our topics, whatever they may be. Again, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. 12:51 now. You're with BC Today. In our last few minutes here, you know what? We are just about a week away until Christmas. So let's get that holiday spirit going with some music now. We're going to end the show with It's Christmas, Snow is Falling. This is performed by Jessica and accompanied by Mike Kenny on piano.
It's been too long since I've seen you, my dear. There's a fire and hot cider for when you get here. All the lights in the tree and the stars in the sky don't shine as bright without you by my side. Train, a sleigh, just in time for Christmas. Snow is falling and I hear the sound of bells ringing across town. People saying it's Christmas. Another year wrapped up, another closets full of presents, stockings in a line. All the bows and curled ribbons mean nothing to me. When I open the door, you're all I want to see. A plane, a train, a sleigh, just in time for Christmas. Snow is falling and I hear the sound of bells ringing across town. People saying it's Christmas. It's been so long since I've seen you, my dear. There's a card in the mail wishing Happy New Year. Sometimes we don't all make it home, but that doesn't mean we spend Christmas alone. A plane, a train, a sleigh, just in time for Christmas. Snow is falling and I hear the sound of bells ringing across town. People saying it's Christmas. Snow is falling and I hear the sound of bells ringing across town. People saying it's Christmas.
12:54 now. You are with BC Today, and to recap our top story again, Canada Post workers are back to work today as per the order from Canada Industrial Relations Board, and that board said there doesn't seem to be a likelihood of an agreement in that dispute at the end of this year, and so ordered services to resume. Today, though, we have seen some citizens showing up, members of other unions. They say they've set up a community picket line in Richmond, and this is at the Canada Post Processing Centre. We heard from Rob Ashton earlier, who was president of the Longshore Workers Union, but he said, I'm there as a citizen, I'm there in solidarity. And we've also heard that there's a group present at the processing centre as well, is called the East Van Workers Assembly. And here's co-lead Zachary Williams.
Cup W situation right now, the strike, it's not just a strike for them, not just a strike for postal workers, but for all workers in Canada, because the right to strike that the Supreme Court says we have is in jeopardy. This is the third time in less than 6 months that the government has invoked Section 107 of the Labor Code, completely squashing that right to strike. And if we don't fight now to defend that right and to advance it, it doesn't mean anything. And the strike at the end of the day is the weapon that workers have to fight for our interests, to fight for our demands, and to create a society that actually works for the vast majority. That's why we're here.
Lots more to come on this story for you throughout the day, of course, here on CBC and Radio 1. Many emails coming to our email inbox here on BC Today. We have an email from Tatiana who writes, I agree with the caller Eric. They are paid well for an unskilled job and are essential. Think of the ripple effect on Canadians' lives. There are many reports of people missing opportunities for school or travel, etc. And May writes, I'm a climate activist who'd like to express support for the Canada Post workers who are still holding picket lines or concerned over Section 107 and what it means for future union negotiations. I very much empathize with emotions and challenges that come up while engaging in actions that the public consider disruptive. I understand this will affect some people more than others, particularly small businesses. I kindly ask the rest of us put our annoyance and instead, or put aside our annoyance and choose to support those trying to fight for change. Thank you. Lots more emails coming in. Thanks so much for them. We'll put them together for you for tomorrow's program. I'm Michelle Elliott. Thanks for joining BC Today. I hope you have a great afternoon. Stay dry out there.